Well, hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Dan Levin, and this is Essential Questions. Thank you for joining this special edition of Essential Questions as we ask what's going on in Israel in the midst of this terrible attack and the war that is ensuing. On the morning of October 7th, 2023, the 22nd day of Tishri 5784, the morning of Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, the terrorist organization Hamas mounted a sophisticated surprise attack on the south of the state of Israel. Launching thousands of missiles that overwhelmed Israel's Iron Dome capacities, hundreds and hundreds of terrorists breached the border and attacked Israeli kibbutzim, cities, and towns all across southern Israel. The atrocities that were committed overwhelmed the mind and the soul. At a dance party near Kibbutz Re'im, more than 260 young people were surrounded and killed, and many more wounded as they tried to escape. Terrorists penetrated communities and went door to door, attacking and killing people in their homes, separating parents from their children, carrying off women, children, elderly, and entire families as hostages into Gaza. More than 300,000 reserve troops have been mobilized. The nation has declared war. At last count, the death count from the initial attack in 3 days of war surpasses 900 people. The events since Saturday morning confound the imagination. Israel has suffered a wound more grievous than at any time in her history, and there are plenty of horrible wounds before this. The Jewish people endured more bloodshed on Saturday, losing more precious souls in one day than any day since the Holocaust. The entirety of the Jewish people around the world, and especially in the state of Israel, are reeling. We are angry, confused, terrified, grief-stricken, and sick with worry. And there was no one that I wanted to talk to about what's happening in Israel in this moment than Rabbi Joshua Weinberg. Josh serves as the Vice President for the Union for Reform Judaism for Israel and Reform Zionism and is the Executive Director of ARZA, the Association of Reform Zionists of America. He was ordained from the Hebrew Union College in the Israeli Rabbinic Program in Jerusalem. He came on Aliyah to Israel in 2003 and serves as a reserve officer in the IDF Spokesman's Unit. Josh has taught and lectured widely throughout Israel, the United States, and Europe, as well as on Kivunim and Shnat Netzer gap year programs. Originally from Chicago, where his father, Michael Weinberg, my friend, served as rabbi of Temple Beth Israel in Skokie for 34 years. He earned his bachelor's from the University of Wisconsin in Hebrew Literature, Political Science, and International Relations, and a master's from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Jewish Education. Josh, thank you so much in the midst of what I know is an agonizing and difficult time for you to be with us.
Well, thank you, Dan, Rabbi Levin, and thank you for inviting me and making space for this during this time.
So, we're all watching television and reading Facebook and following things in the news in the various different portals that we access, and we hear about what's happened there. But as someone who is so intimately involved with the communities in the South and in the state of Israel, what can you tell us about what it was like for those communities in southern Israel in the midst of the attack?
Well, thank you. And I think it's hard for any of us to really comprehend the magnitude of such an attack. And we read the accounts. I think what it was like for most people is just sheer fear and disbelief. In a little bit, I'll also say about struggling with their faith in the government and the army to protect them. I think the border has been so secure, even to imagine. We know in years past, in different skirmishes and wars that we've had with Gaza, that the tunnels were dug under Gaza and into Israel where terrorists could really infiltrate and come out. And Israel poured a great deal of resources and finances into putting a cement block very deep in the ground to prevent those, access through the tunnels. And this was a calculated precision attack in which they just bulldozed right through the fence. right there. And so people were sort of in shock and couldn't believe that something like this could happen. And then we began to hear the stories of the people locked in their safe rooms, in their mamadim, in their homes on 22 different kibbutzim and moshavim throughout the area, not knowing what is exactly happening, not being able to, contact or have, talk to the outside world, and just sheer and utter fear for either death or, God forbid, people being kidnapped. And just one account, I recommend people reading the account of Haaretz journalist and diplomatic correspondent Amir Tibon, who talked of his 3-year-old and 1-year-old in a really harrowing and unbelievably heroic tale of them, having to keep quiet for 10 hours in the dark in a room. I know, when my kids were 3 and 1, there was no way that they would be able to do that. And then his father, a retired army general, also very connected to our Reform community in Tel Aviv, coming down to rescue them and going hand-to-hand combat with terrorists and gunshots and gunfighting, in addition to the thousands and thousands of rockets that have been sent. Sometimes we don't think about the magnitude and the fear and the trauma that those endure. And so just a terrible, tragic war that is going on right now. And I'll say even a massacre. We know that the numbers are now up to over 900 people killed. 900 people killed, which is just unfathomable for us right now.
So you've served in the IDF and you know what it is. Tell me, what is it like for a soldier to be called up for active duty? What is it that these young men and women, these hundreds of thousands of people now who are mobilized, what are they thinking and feeling in this moment? If you can share a little bit of your experience.
Sure. And for full disclaimer, I was in the spokesperson's unit. So I was not an active combat duty soldier, although I do know many people. And I can think I can share that what they're experiencing right now is again fear, because we know that there's going to be an air incursion into Gaza that's already begun, of course, and the IDF and the defense establishment is trying to pinpoint and precision target Hamas areas and Hamas headquarters and Hamas, holdouts within the Gaza Strip, and everyone, of course, is trying to locate the kidnapped people. Over 100 people have been kidnapped, women, children, elderly, which makes it really, really difficult. And the only way to do that is really through a ground incursion. And we've seen this in the past. We avoided it in 2021, but in 2014 it was just horrible. And so over the 300,000 people who have been called up right now, we know that is likely going to be a scenario, which means that people are being called up to be directly in harm's way, to go in and try to save the lives of those who are kidnapped. Can't imagine what it's like to be that soldier or to be the parent of those soldiers who are going to have to do that terrible duty.
So give us, if you can, a little bit of an historical understanding. Who is Hamas?
Yeah.
Where did they come from? What do they represent? How did they come to power? And what could possibly have been their motivation in this terrible, terrible attack?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and we need to we need to really understand. And I'll try and do that without going back to Avram Avinu or to even David Ben Gurion. A few pieces along the timeline that we do need to understand is that, of course, after the 6-Day War of 1967, Israel's borders grew exponentially, by tripled essentially, and they gave back the Sinai Peninsula in 1979 as part of the agreement with Egypt, the Camp David Accords, and by 82 was already evacuated, and they still maintained control over what some call the West Bank, what others call Judea and Samaria, and the Gaza Strip. And Israel sort of saw those areas as holding on to them ostensibly temporarily, in that they would always be part of a negotiation for a lasting and sort of final status arrangement. Since 1967, there have also been additional settlements, Jewish settlements established there in those areas. There were 14 settlements in the Gaza Strip and several hundred in the West Bank, or at least around 147 in the West Bank. And the Oslo process tried to gradually grant over towards a two-state solution, which would essentially be based on this land for peace equation, in which Israel would give the land that it was holding to the Palestinians to establish a state, which would then result in three things: in peace, recognition, and the end of conflict. Okay, the Oslo process came out of a time period from about 1987 to 1991, which most of us sort of refer to as the First Intifada. Now, during the Intifada, when violence broke out with the Palestinian desire to sort of shake off Israel's occupation, and here I just want to put a caveat, if I can, that when someone says the word occupation, we have to understand what they mean by that. Okay, do they mean the occupation of 1967 or the occupation of 1948? If they mean 1948, that they're essentially saying that the state of Israel is not legitimate and is illegally occupying Palestinian land, and that's
Right.
an important distinction to make.
Yeah, when you hear people say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, these are people who are not talking about a two-state solution. These are people who are talking about a one-state solution that involves the
Right.
expunging of Israel from the map, right?
Yes, generally speaking, I would agree. So during that first Intifada in 1988, a separate group was created. The Palestinians were, sort of being ruled by the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which after 1993 became the Palestinian Authority and was set to sort of become the established government of the state of Palestine once it should be established. The group that they created was an Islamic religious group. I don't like to use the word fundamentalist. That feels more like a Christian word than an Islamic word, but okay, you get the point. And they called themselves the Islamic Resistance Movement, or in Arabic, the Haraka al-Mukawama al-Islamiyya. And if you take the acronym of those words in Arabic, it spells the word Hamas. Okay, so Hamas is specifically Islamic, which the PLO, even though they're all Muslims, is not a religious fundamental organization. And they wrote in their charter, which if anyone just Googles the Hamas charter, you'll be able to see it online, that one of their clearly expressed goals was to destroy the state of Israel. Very, very, very clearly laid out. And Hamas became a terrorist organization. We know that they were in charge, they were responsible for many, many terrorist attacks, taking us back, to when Bus 18 in Jerusalem blew up in the mid-90s, 95, 96, and in Dizengoff Center in Tel Aviv, and many, many terrorist attacks along the way, including thousands and thousands of rockets that have been fired over the last, 10, 15, 20 years from Gaza into Israel. I do want to highlight an important date, an important occurrence that took place without going through the entire history, and I will for sure leave some out here, but that's what happened in 2005. 2005 is a very, very significant year for a number of different reasons. But for the main reason here is that after about 4 years of violence, which some call the Second Intifada, after the collapse of the Oslo process, the government led by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon took on or passed a law called the disengagement, in which they were going to remove those 14 Jewish communities or Jewish settlements from the Gaza Strip and relocate them back into Israel proper. They did this unilaterally, without a negotiation or without getting something in return, so to speak. It was in August of 2005. I'm sure many of both you and your listeners remember that time. It was very, very, very difficult, regardless of one's political position, to see this happen. And at that time, the Palestinian community was being led by the Palestinian Authority. And elections took place in 2005. And Abu Mazen, or Mahmoud Abbas, who's currently the PA premier, won those elections. That was the last time, incidentally, that the Palestinians held elections. So he's in year 18 of his 4-year term. But after the disengagement, in which Israel pulled out all of the settlements there, 2 years later, in 2007, Hamas took over in a violent overthrowing of the Palestinian Authority. And that's critical to understand, because the Palestinians of the West Bank are being ruled by the Palestinian Authority, the PA, under Abbas, to which there has been significant security cooperation between them and Israel. And Gaza has been run by Hamas. There's also other smaller groups like Islamic Jihad there as well. What's interesting is that we see Hamas as a terrorist organization, which they are, but some in Gaza also see them as a social welfare organization as well, providing education systems and after school programming for youth, for Gazans, and they really rule the day there. Think about sort of like an emerging country that is ruled by a terrorist organization, also known as like Hamas Stan, and that's what's been happening since the disengagement of 2005. A great many of the resources that have been poured into Gaza, and Israel delivers building material, food, supplies, medicine, water, gasoline, electricity to the Gaza Strip. A lot of that has been taken by Hamas and essentially turned into weapons. When we think about rockets being shot or tunnels being dug, where do they get the cement to build those tunnels? Where do they get the material to develop rockets? Some of that comes across through the tunnels from Egypt at the Rafah border crossing, but some is the materials that we have given for the development of Gaza, but it really has been turned into weaponry. So what were they trying to achieve? It's hard for us to understand. There's a few ways to think about it. Their first goal was to simply kill Jews. Okay, this was not a combat operation where one army was fighting another army, and as you mentioned in your really eloquent intro, this came 50 years and one day since the Yom Kippur War, in which there were two armies fighting. This was a pure and simple attack on civilians. Their goal was to kill as many as possible and to take as many hostage and bring them back into Gaza to then later be used as negotiating chips or cards in a further negotiation or prisoner exchange and swap with Israel. Some might speculate that a secondary goal was that they were being funded and supported by Iran, by the Islamic Republic of Iran, in which this was used to try and disrupt any potential for a normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia. We've seen that, and we know that the Prime Minister Netanyahu was just in New York meeting with President Biden on the cusp of a potential normalization agreement. We don't know the backroom details of how close they were getting or not. We can only speculate, but that this was at a time when that was getting closer. And of course, the Saudis, encouraged the Palestinians to be included in that deal. And we know that this is also a moment to take advantage of the splintering within Israeli society. For the past 9 months, many have been protesting. Hundreds of thousands of people have been out in the streets protesting their own government because of the coalition's legislative agenda, which some deem to be, including myself, to be a threat to Israel's democracy. That was a sore moment to be exploited by Hamas, which I have to say has demonstrated their sheer barbarism and cruelty in the way that they have just killed innocents and dragging women and children through the streets of Gaza has been unbelievably difficult to see.
The images are absolutely horrifying. There was one story that I heard that a woman and her 4-year-old and 6-month-old child were abducted, and she was kept. They left the 4-year-old with a shrapnel injury in his leg and the 6-month-old baby at the border on the side of the road. Thank God
Yeah.
they were found and were brought to the hospital. We have no word on the health or the welfare of their mother. But that's just one of so many stories. So, we hear these stories of Hamas where we're familiar with the need for Israel, it seems, every few years to mount some kind of a campaign. There was the attack in 2014 that was precipitated by the kidnapping of 3 boys from a bus stop in Samaria, in Judea, in the southern part of the West Bank. And then there were all the rockets that came over, and then there was a ground incursion there. And then back in 2021, there were many rockets that went over the fence again. It seems you get more rockets raining down than actual rainfall in the state of Israel. People were kind of used to that. This was an attack that seemed so much more audacious and much more barbaric than anything we had really ever seen before. And so there is a question, I think, about who are the people that live in the Gaza Strip. There are 2.5 million people that live in the Gaza Strip. It is the most densely populated place on the planet. And there's, you hear from people, I think, in many ways reacting with anger and frustration that they should just flatten Gaza. But of course, you can't flatten a place with 2.5 million people, not if you want to hold any sense of moral valence and to never, not surrender our own moral principles. So, is there a way to distinguish between who is Hamas and who subscribes to Hamas or Islamic Jihad, some of these different parties, and the Palestinian people? Are they one and the same? Are they different? How do we distinguish that?
Yeah, really important question, and I appreciate you making that distinction and saying, there are people who are calling for Gaza to be reduced back into the Stone Ages, and of course we can't do that. So Hamas is a terrorist organization, is an actual organization with members of it. It has a political branch as well as a military branch, and of course, not all Palestinians are terrorists. To let that be said, that's really, really important to say. There are many Palestinians who want peace. There are many Palestinians who just wake up in the morning and want to provide for their families and have a nice life, free of anything, free of politics, free of occupation, free of all those things. And we have to support that. As a Zionist, I want to say that I deeply support the rights of a Palestinian state and Palestinians to, self-actualization and self-determination, all of that stuff. That is incredibly important. And I think that most of the residents of Gaza are also held hostage by Hamas, actually, in that Hamas knows very well that Israel is going to have to strike back and attack Gaza. And the higher the death toll in Gaza, the more sympathy the Palestinians receive, and the more the international community then attacks Israel. And I know that we're going to see the tides turn very quickly. That with any sort of retaliation that amounts here, the international community will look at it. We're already seeing that. We're already seeing rallies in support of Palestinian rights. Sick, I think, celebrations of Palestinians passing out candy, and not just in the area, around the world, Palestinian community celebrating this unbelievable massacre. So yes, it is incredibly important to differentiate and to distinguish. I know many Palestinians. I know many of our colleagues around North America have very close connections with Palestinians, both Israeli citizens and Palestinians in the West Bank, and we've met with them and heard them, and we want the same things. We want to work together for peace, and that's why this is not a war against the Palestinians. This is a war against Hamas, who came and carried out this brutal massacre.
And I think to ask Israelis to have sympathy for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip is a hard lift, given the incredible horror that has been visited on Israel in the last few days. And yet, at the same time, there is this sense that we don't want this war, this attack, to rob us of our humanity, to rob us of our principles, to make us less human. There is always the adage from Pirkei Avot, "B'makom she'ein anashim hishtadel lihyot ish." In a place where there is no humanity, one must strive to remain humane. And so, as I'm hearing in some of the briefings that I've listened to, the Israelis are still doing the roof knocking that they've become famous for before they commit an airstrike to warn the people in different buildings that they need to evacuate. And then, of course, at the same time, when we heard Prime Minister Netanyahu say, you need to evacuate, you need to get out, in a place like the Gaza Strip, where is it that they can go?
Right, there's not much territory left, and then what's going to happen once their homes are destroyed? It's only going to turn into a further or greater humanitarian disaster where it is right there. I agree with you that it's hard to have sympathy right now, especially when you saw the carnage and see this terrible footage that's going on right now. I was asked by an American journalist, about the possible restraint by Israel, and I said, let me ask you a question. When how many 2,700 Americans were killed on September the 11th of 2001. The United States entered into an 18-year war, which claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghanis. And I said, okay, was that a proportional response? And what I think is important to maintain, to be that ish b'makom she'en anashim, right, to be humane where there is no humanity, is that this retaliation not be motivated solely by revenge, and that it be tactical and a military strike, really to cripple Hamas and the Hamas, upper echelons of their leadership as much as possible.
And yet at the same time, I feel like listening to the webinar that was produced by the Reform Movement, where those who are living in what we call the Gaza envelope are so angry with their government and angry that Hamas was allowed to continue to exist after all of these incursions. There's a sense of, if you want me to be able to continue to live in what has always been the state of Israel. I mean, I think that's important for people to recognize, is that these communities, these kibbutzim, these agricultural communities in small cities and towns in the southern part of Israel, that are absolutely beautiful places. I've visited so many times and met the people in these kibbutzim. These spaces were never part of an Arab country ever. From the partition plan all the way through to today, these were always part of what was the state of Israel.
Sure.
And I think that we sometimes lose sight of that piece. And I remember visiting one of the kibbutzim, Kfar Aza, a few years ago, and talking with some of the people who live there. The kibbutz is idyllic. It's beautiful. And I said, "Why do you live here? It's so dangerous." And they said, "Why wouldn't we live here? It's beautiful. It's tranquil. I don't want the hustle and bustle of Tel Aviv. I don't want the craziness of Jerusalem. I just want this beautiful, idyllic place where I can raise my kids, where I don't have to lock my door. They can walk from place to place."
Right. They can run around and yeah.
One can only imagine how hard it is, of course, to live there. One of the things that I also think about is how many people that I met down there lived down there specifically because they tried to forge relationships across the border in whatever way possibly they can with their Palestinian neighbors, to create initiatives for understanding and, if at all possible, for peace, to create work. One of the amazing things was that the leader of the regional council of that area, who was killed defending his community,
Yeah. Ofer Lipstein.
oh, yeah, whom I had met a few years ago, an incredibly inspiring man, was trying to build an industrial complex where Israelis and Palestinians could work together so that it would
Right.
enrich both sides of the wall. But at the same time, you're hearing from those people saying, if you don't eradicate Hamas, like eradicate them, I'm not living here, and you can't expect me to live here, and you owe that to me. But the lift that will be required to eradicate Hamas is going to be extraordinary.
Yeah, and it's hard to say because look, again, we're not dealing with people in uniforms and easily identifiable targets from a military point of view. It's hard to say who has sympathy for Hamas and who doesn't, and it's just an unbelievably complex situation. And yeah, there are many along the border, as you said. Ofer was really developing an industrial park, and there have been people with an idea for a joint amusement park that would have entrances on either side, and people could meet in the middle, and that would be amazing. It is just an incredibly tragic situation in which none of that can happen. We know that prime ministers in the past have done everything that they can to allow more workers to come in from Gaza. And if you see the Erez checkpoint there, which is one of the main checkpoints for delivering, schora, like supplies, essentially, or materials, it's set up like a proper border crossing between any other country. There's, an option for duty free and passport control, in which one day people could go back and forth from Gaza or from Palestine to Israel and have open borders. The question is really, how do we eradicate Hamas? How has that happened? How do we put something else in its place? And I wish I had those easy answers. Anyone who does, I think, will have
You and me both.
their Nobel Peace Prize coming. There have been lots of plans. Even the current head of the opposition, Yair Lapid, published a plan, a development plan for Gaza, in which there would be an airport and a seaport and like a Riviera, and it would be all built up. And it is just incredibly, incredibly tragic.
Yeah, I think the tragedy is that since 2005, almost 19 years since that disengagement, and I will talk about that in a moment. They could have used all of that material and all of that money to build an extraordinary society. They could have built universities, they could have built infrastructure, they could have built industry, they could have developed agriculture. And instead, they used all of that for materials of war. It's incredibly demoralizing just even to consider it.
Yeah,
One of the things that I think about, though, is that since the election last November, which created this incredibly right-wing government that came to power that has, through their proposals of judicial reform, really torn Israeli society asunder with, week after week after week of protests from both sides. In what way do you think that dysfunction and the divisiveness that was sort of boiling over in Israeli society, in what way did that contribute to what we saw? And in what way do you think that will impact Israel's ability to respond?
yeah. It's almost hard to say right now because it's too early to tell. I think it is definitely a factor that went into it, but we didn't, hear specifically from any party that took credit for this and said, we're striking now because, you Jews are fighting each other, and so we're going to go in. We know that they had been watching very closely. They even knew about this rave, this party in nature that took place late Friday night and went, to the morning, in which I think over 250 people were massacred from this party. But we do know on several occasions that the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, even back in April, publicly warned the prime minister that the army was really unfit and that resources would be taken away. And some of the high brass of the army, the top brass of the army, was refusing to show up for reserve duty because of the policies that were being taken, because of their lack of trust and faith in their own government. The chief of staff, Herzl Levy, requested an audience with the prime minister several times to explain to him where he saw some of the vulnerability, and that wasn't granted. And this is not the time to point fingers or to lay blame right now. However, we do know that this was a colossal failure of the state of Israel and of the IDF to protect its citizens and to watch the border. We know that the pinpoint operation that Hamas took out included taking out in one fell swoop all of the cameras along the fence and then going into a room and slaughtering 24 of what we call in Hebrew the tatzpitaniyot, the military intelligence. They are like scouts, but watching their radar screens with every inch of that fence, and they were all murdered. And so we know that it's hard to say, but that whenever there is a weakness within Israel, that gets exploited.
So when we think about the response that we've seen already, I mean, I think about what Rabbi Nir Barkin, Kilat Yozma, who's a dear friend to me and to our congregation, was talking about kibbutz Nir Oz, which is bordering the Gaza Strip. And of the 320 members of the kibbutz, they lost 60 people who were murdered.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
You think about a
Unbelievable.
community that lost 1 in 5 members, it's almost overwhelming. And he called and he spoke to the leaders of that kibbutz and says, "What do you need?" And they said, "Everything,
Everything.
from toothbrushes to furniture."
Yeah.
He said, "There's no point." I'm going to read from something he sent me. "There is no point in me naming the whole list of items that he mentioned. The members of Nir Oz are left with nothing. They are physically, emotionally, and mentally destitute.
Yeah.
Most of them have lost loved ones dearest to them, and they're trying their best to create initiatives to provide relief supplies." I know he said that his community was providing all kinds of care packages with hygienic products and goodies and baby formula and all kinds of different things they're collecting. There's a member of our community who created his own charity years ago, the Helping Israel Fund,
Yeah.
and he's trying to provide the kinds of things that the soldiers will need, hygiene products, battery backups for their cell phones, other kinds of material that will help protect the soldiers in their work. What are you seeing in terms of how Israel has responded as a society so far?
Well, Israel is an incredibly resilient society that has responded, within minutes of people organizing and mobilizing and trying to provide the necessary items. I'm even, seeing pictures of our own. You mentioned Yozma, another one not far away, Kilat Nefeser Zion, that has turned their synagogue into really a collection center for the necessary materials, whether it's clothing or toiletries or hygiene products or food and medicine that are being given now to the people affected in that area, as well as other communities just simply opening their doors and saying, you have to get out of there or your house has been burned and is unlivable. Come. I was speaking with someone on our kibbutzim in the south, in the Arava Valley near Eilat, and all the way up to the north, and they all need our help. They all need our help. In addition, we know that the soldiers have been drastically underprepared, in the stockpiles of weapons and supplies been depleted. We're talking about ceramic flak jackets, helmets, boots, guns, everything. The Friends of the IDF is carrying out a massive campaign, and we are encouraging all of our people to come together with the Jewish Federations of North America for one very, very significant campaign. Of course, all of the other campaigns that you see are holy and are important. I would just caution people to verify links that they have been sent, because we know of increased cyber attacks that are happening. So I do want to make your listeners aware of that. That if you get a link from a friend that's been passed from a friend to a friend to a friend, we know the 100 people who were kidnapped, all of their cell phones are compromised. And so the worst thing that we could do is, send to what looks like a legitimate donation link and have it be not legitimate, and have it either go to Hamas or to be spreading viruses, throughout our systems. That is a risk. But it is incredibly important now to come together to support these massive campaigns, whether it's the Jewish Federation of North America supporting our own reform movement in Israel that's been doing incredible work. Our Rabbi Yael Vergan in the 10 kibbutzim around the Gaza area and the city of Sderot has been, just holding her people together. That is really what's needed. There's some very real needs. I've been getting lots of different people reaching out to say how they can go and volunteer, and whether that's to fight or to give support. And that's going to take some time to develop just yet. But right now there is a great deal of a need for support, both financially and in kind, as much as possible.
I think it's so frustrating for so many of us who live here thousands of miles away. I think we all resonate to those words that were written 900 years ago by Yehuda Halevi, who said, Libi b'mizrach v'ani b'sof ha'ma'arav. My
Yeah.
heart is in the east, but I'm at the edge of the west. And this feeling of impotence that we can't do. But of course, our tradition teaches that one of the things that we can do is tzedakah, right? So we can support the Jewish Federations of North America. And you can give to the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County for those who live near Temple Beth El here in Boca Raton. But any of the Federation communities, their emergency campaign is all going to be pooled to support the relief efforts in Israel. Please consider supporting Magen David Adom, who are providing health and relief benefits to first responders. And of course, the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism, which is helping the individual reform congregations and communities who are doing the nitty gritty on the grounds help that is necessary. As you look forward, Josh, as someone who has studied Israel and has made Israel his home for so long, and who is almost as much of a Zionist as me, which is hard to imagine, but I'll give you that kind of credit.
Yeah.
What do you see looking forward? What gives you the greatest angst as you sort of think about how this is going to evolve in the days ahead?
So First of all, thank you. And I'm at heart an optimist. And it's been hard these past 2 days. I mean, it's been hard to see the silver lining here through the tears. And I found myself I just broke down and started crying over Shabbat lunch with my family, with my kids. And it was very, very difficult. I think that we will come out of this and we will rebuild, and we're a resilient people and a resilient nation. I hope that happens. My hope is that we can see through and learn how to grow, and we can bury our loved ones right now and really unify together to build our country and to build those bridges with Jews around the world. And I want American Jews to understand that we are connected, that we have a role in this. And in addition to giving tzedakah, I want to say that I want to ask all of our members, all of your listeners, to reach out to their friends and family in Israel, to send that virtual hug. It matters and it helps them. And people are struggling right now. And we also need help here managing how to make sense of all of these stories. When we think about our kids who are not subscribing to the New York Times or Haaretz or the Wall Street Journal or the Jerusalem Post, but are getting most of their information from social media, whether it's Instagram or TikTok, and don't really know how to process some of these things. When people say that Hamas were freedom fighters and they're just doing it against the occupation, that is not true. Okay, and that is unfortunate. And our kids need to know that this was just an unprovoked attack, and this was not because of any specific policy or any specific issue. And we need to help them understand that and help them do that in the ways that they process information. But again, I'm given hope, and when I think about hope, I go back to our sources. As Dan, you mentioned Pirkei Avot earlier. I'm thinking about the book of Jeremiah, and it comes from a passage that we read on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, in chapter 31, where Jeremiah says to the people of Israel, he says, "Yesh tikva lecharit yamim v'shavu banim legvulam," that there is hope for the end of the days, that the children should be returned to their borders. And that is my hope, and that is my prayer for this moment right now.
I so appreciate those sentiments, and I think it's important to give people a sense of where they can go to get good, authentic, balanced news. So, one, I would strongly encourage to those listening to the podcast to check out timesofisrael.com, which is an English language Israeli online news publication, and they do a phenomenal job of presenting things in as balanced, I think, as possible, given the complexities of what exists there. The other organization, especially if you have kids who are on campus or in school and aren't sure where to get good information, one organization you can check out is called Stand With Us. You can go to standwithus.com, and they provide ways for you to understand the conflict and to be able to engage in meaningful dialogue with those who may be trying to obfuscate the truth. And then for those who want to read, there are many good books. Two that I would recommend are Ari Shavit's book called My Promised Land and Micah Goodman's book called Catch 67. Two very good books. Josh, are there books or places you would encourage people to go to get meaningful information so they can build their knowledge base?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it can be overwhelming, and one can feel like they're drinking from a fire hose with all of the information available. But I'll second your endorsement for the Times of Israel. There are some really important books coming out. Professor Hillel Cohen's book from recent times about the history of the conflict. I'd also say Daniel Sokach's book, How We Talk About Israel, is really helpful, and really the English language media, Haaretz, Jerusalem Post, and Times of Israel are the most important sources. I'll also offer the Promise podcast, which I think is an important source for how to analyze and how to think about some of these things. And in shameless self promotion, I'll also offer your listeners the ability to subscribe to my own newsletter, in which I write once a week. I'm happy to share the link in the notes of the podcast with people. But I think none of that can replace talking to actual people. And I hope that people continue to do that. And I think that you're absolutely right in saying that it can be confusing, it can be complicated, but I'm going to give your listeners the benefit of the doubt in that they are smart people and that they can read and process information, and that's going to be really important to keep doing throughout this process, to see, to learn, to read, and to really internalize the war that we find ourselves in, and the deep tragedies and all that's involved in it.
Well, Josh, I just want to thank you for your time and your leadership. I know this is an agonizing moment for you and your family, as it is for so many. Encourage everyone to visit ARZA.org, where you can learn more about what the Reform Movement is doing in its Zionist activities led by Josh, and ways that you can subscribe also to his newsletter and get more information. And we pray collectively for the strength and the resilience of the state of Israel and her people, and that the war there should be concluded swiftly and effectively and decisively, and that peace will soon be restored. Josh, thanks so much for being with us. Essential Questions has been made possible by the Temple Beth El Jewish Ideas Incubator, committed to creativity and innovation in modern Jewish life. Many thanks to our production team, Jason Reeser, Amanda Brentzel, Jake Harris, Susan Stallone, and Eliza List. Special thanks to Jake Harris for original music and Isabella Tenenbaum for the original artwork. You can find this podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, and the Podbean app, as well as on Temple Bethel's website at tbeboca.org/essential questions. You can rate us on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you can spread the word, and we certainly want to know what your essential questions are. Email us at eq@tbeboca.org. We look forward to reading your comments and to addressing your ideas in future episodes. I'm Rabbi Dan Levin, and thanks so much for listening to the Essential Questions podcast.